I've read Michael D. Langone's Recovery from Cults. I would say piece by piece, maybe 2.5 or 3 times at this point. It's been extremely enlightening and extremely helpful over the years. I think it would probably be a book that anybody could benefit from reading, just because it addresses a lot of ways to identify cultic structure regardless of the content of the belief system, as well as ways to identify and resist forms of unwanted social control, which is something I think everybody can benefit from, if they're looking to empower themselves in different settings or arenas or their career. But usually what it takes for somebody to pick up a book with the title Recovery from Cults is, of course, you've hit a serious, difficult point in your life, or you're interested in that specific area of mental health or study. And there's an idea in this book that I find very interesting that I wanted to explore a little bit with my own input. It's the concept of a pre-cult personality. And in the book, when different contributors, because the book is not just written by Michael D. Langone, it's a collection of essays and chapters and accounts, etc., by many different experts in the fields. So there's this recurring concept of the pre-cult personality. And this refers to this concept that there are people who are born into these cults and are indoctrinated with the ideology from birth. And then there are people who join the cult after having been alive for however many years and existed in a culture, background, context other than, being born into the cult. And that concept of the pre-cult personality it's not an absolute, it's just meant to be functional working knowledge, so that if someone is born into the cult without having existed in a prior context outside of the regulation of this high control group, they're just going to have maybe different needs and a different experience than someone with a pre-cult personality, as the concept is termed. But I think that's largely just a broad, categorical, functional, working knowledge term, because and the paradox that I'm actually experiencing as I talk about this is that I never, got past really like Division 6 public level courses in Scientology, and I definitely, I feel still that I benefited from certain things in Scientology relative to my context of when and where I studied them. A lot of it's about context, you know. Maybe Scientology is a detrimental organization if you come from a wealthy, high-functioning family that provides you with, you know, every level of your Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It provides you with the ability to create order and pursue your goals. Maybe Scientology would just be easily dismissed. But then if you know, you're from perhaps a chaotic environment, or you're in the middle of a country that's like 100 times more totalitarian than Scientology, maybe Scientology's the good cop in that scenario. It's really about context. So there is no like shame or guilt in being like, you know, hey, this was good for me and I do not have to disown that from myself. So that's just one thing. And then again, I have been in social contexts where I've had to pretend to disown that stuff from myself to gain approval or other opportunities. If you're in like a job interview with someone who, you know, is blatantly like looking for a firm good guy, bad guy paradigm, and you need the money, like it's okay to like not, you know, expose your entire laundry list of everything you feel you've done wrong in order to allow yourself to be compatible with an environment. And I think, again, paradoxically, that's another thing that I feel Scientology's confessional model can engender in people, is a sense that it's a debilitating sense that, oh, I thought a bad thing about this person, I can never speak to them again unless I confess it to someone or confess it to them. And it forces you to be your own like moral police on such a level where, you know, you're subordinating yourself to everyone around you. And I think a good, healthy person would be like, you don't need to tell me that, that's your business. But there are some very bad exploitative people that can take advantage of your over confession. And I still have my I have very, very firm, probably uptight moral standards. You know, I don't really like to engage in Machiavellian or cheating, you know, behavior, but I do notice that in some of my peers, I've seen that their interpretation of that is very subjective and sometimes very morally relative and sometimes just wrong. And I've seen people who have that moral kind of trait like advance in the world. So it's like I still avoid any kind of like moral breaches, because it's not something I'm really comfortable with. And I also think that like I'm definitely getting fair game by the church, and it's possible they've put me on some sort of like FBI watch list or some kind of community watch list where if I do things that my other peers have gotten away with and have even used to leverage their success, I will be like policed and like witch trialed for it. So even if I really wanted to be like a super Machiavellian, like dark triad, you know, climber, I like wouldn't even be able to get away with it. So like Right. So that's another thing, that, you know, there's the paradox of like, yes, I think it is a valid cycle of stress and emotional regulation that exists in numerous religions to confess things that are weighing on you. It's maybe like even, I don't know if you could purely say it's just an early form of therapy, because, you know, people have always had, you know, their personal advisors, and they've also had in numerous religions a confessional model. I don't know if all religious figures have had this confessional model purely for the purpose of offering this redemption for their followers. I don't know if there have been some, you know, historical, you know, confession booths where people are literally like writing down everything about you and using it to like sabotage you or like act as some kind of behind the scenes power broker. I don't really know how that works. Like, I don't know how that works in the Catholic Church. Like, do they sign NDAs? What's the deal? Like, I don't know if you're like a really important or powerful person, like, would you even feel comfortable going in that confession booth? Like, anyway, it's scary. But this idea of religious confession is not quite the same as having a therapist or an advisor, because it involves the concept of an all-seeing spiritual entity in whom you can put an absolute sense of trust the way you can't assign to other human beings. And the, you know, whether you believe this is real or whether you believe this is a metaphor, there's plenty of people in religions who are like, yeah, I see these narratives as more of a metaphor. I believe in God, but kind of as a metaphor. Just the stress regulation of being able to put certain intellectual and emotional weight onto a real or imagined all-seeing spiritual being that has no conflict of interest in the physical world is a huge stress regulator in and of itself, real or imaginary. You know, perhaps thinking not in terms of real versus imaginary and more in terms of conceptual is more relevant, because a lot of how we regulate our own stress is based in the conceptual. And so when you have an entire indoctrination system like a high control group such as Scientology that says it's all or nothing, you can't just do some things and then fudge it with other things. Legally, they have to say you can, like in the front end, in the Div 6, but as you get more and more involved, it's really like not aligned with their goals to uphold, you know, an idea of not being all or nothing with the ideology. If you have an indoctrination like Scientology that says our way is the only way, you cannot advance as a being unless you just do more courses and spend more money and spend more hours here. You will not, you know, we will be, you know, and some organizations and high control groups aren't telling you to spend money or buy the courses. So it's not wholly just about money here. You know, if you want to get scammed of money, you can get scammed by like someone on the internet easily, and it's not a cult. So, Scientology, it's not just about money. There's a clear ideological factor happening, and there are many cults and high control groups that are not like, they may exert like a high level of financial influence, but I don't think that's not their goal. Like, if you just wanted money, you could be a scammer. There's other ways to do that. So, like, if you have a system like Scientology that says, okay, here's your first course, that's cool, right? That helped you study, that helped you organized your project. Like, you've had wins, you got a promotion, you improved at your job, you upped your sales, your income. This helped you. This helped your family. This helped you, organize your garage. This helped, de-stimulate, de-interbulate you. Those entry-level courses are, they've got practical common sense in there that I found, helpful. I think a lot of people have found helpful. Now, just so you know, you're not going to be able to accomplish anything else without, our courses, our ideology, our indoctrination. So you sit there feeling totally, if you internalize that belief, you sit there feeling completely debilitated, where you're like, okay, all the other knowledge and, applied knowledge, except for Scientology, is basically garbage. It's going to be a waste of my time. So I can't just do that. I have to just do more Scientology or I'm screwed. Now, this idea of, sticking to one method and one ideology is not in and of itself bad, right? Like, there are many artistic techniques, there's many computer coding languages, there's many, schools of law and schools of medicine that are going to say, okay, look, in order to learn this whole system, you've got to learn all the rules. You've got to learn exactly how it works. If you want to learn painting and you want to learn chiaroscuro, you're learning a system. And that in and of itself is not bad, it's not oppressive. At least that's what I believe. Because you, as a human being, are exerting the agency to say, okay, I'm going to learn this system, I'm going to listen to this teacher, I'm going to get a good grade in their class by learning all the rules to how this system works. This doesn't mean I'm becoming brainwashed. It means I'm learning this particular system, and then I'll be able to use that system how I see fit in other contexts. If you want to learn ballet or some very high precision practice of any kind, if you want to learn like computer coding, you're going to have to, when you learned to read and write, you learned the alphabet, and you can't go to the teacher and say, I made up 5 new letters, I'm going to like work it in. That's not gonna, you can do that, but that's not learning the system and being able to use it. People do invent words, and that's fine, but it's like, if you're gonna learn a system first and learn how to apply it in a predictable, precise way, maybe later on you'll decide to improve upon that system, but you have to distinguish, this is where I'm learning the system and this is how I'm innovating on my own time. And so it's like, if you go study some high precision skill or any kind of system that you're trying to learn, of course they're going to say, yeah, we're learning, this computer coding language. We're not adding our own ideas and making that part of this class. Like, you're going to learn the language so you can use it, and then whatever you choose to do with that after the class, that's your choice. Now, it can be very motivating for a teacher to say, you must learn this and do this and like focus like your whole life on it. You know, if you have the attitude of, oh, I'm not allowed to like tell you what to do, like that can get in the way of like a really focused, committed learning experience. But with you know, with Scientology, it 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 is a continual battle to not have it be all consuming, and it can get in the way of learning valuable information from groups and individuals outside of Scientology. It and so some people have appeared, maybe celebrities, to maintain a balanced diplomacy towards that, where they do, you know, fund Scientology endeavors in schools, but they also say, oh, but I'm a Buddhist and I'm this and I'm that. And they, you know, they may not let that fly with like staff members or recruiters. It depends a lot, I think. It also probably depends on individuals within the church. So back to the paradox that I was experiencing, talking about pre and post cult personality not being an absolute. I do remember with L. Ron Hubbard's writing, there was something he wrote in one of his policies, or just one of his one of the Scientology books, that said nothing is absolute. No ideas are absolute. Nothing. They're all just they're like models. They're paradigms. And, you know, in a certain sense, you could make the case that Scientology is so you could be reductive and say, well, Scientology even says the physical universe is not absolute because we're all spiritual beings who are, to some extent, confined to a physical body. But the way this is addressed in Scientology is not vague discussion and interpretation. It's very, very regulated into a system of applied knowledge called technology, and verbal tech is considered, last I know, as a crime. To sit and discuss and have debates is basically verbal tech, because it's considered, you know, it's considered like the equivalent of like, you know, misinformation, spreading false, harmful, unproductive knowledge. You know, even L. Ron Hubbard said that, at least from what I recall, in one piece of writing or another, that nothing is an absolute. Human beings invented every model of society and applied knowledge that exists. Human beings invented words, but before words and letters and language existed, we still had thoughts. So these are just systems to facilitate our survival and improved quality of life, and our numerous categories of needs and aspirations. So what I interpreted from L. Ron Hubbard's writings is that, Scientology is simply the most effective conglomerate of every religion thus far. But that is not how it is necessarily enforced in every case. And there is a fallacy of this idea that the human mind in its ideal state functions the same way every time. It's just a matter of making sure you achieve the states of spiritual and mental advancement offered by Scientology and Dianetics. So there's a fallacy that I think you can internalize over time, where you think all ideal human mental experiences looks exactly the same. And you internalize the tone, the emotional tone scale, and the Hubbard chart of human evaluation as a very clear scientific categorization of what healthy behavior scaled down to unhealthy behavior looks like. And this chart of human behavior, which usually is shorthand summarized into the emotional tone scale, because the emotional tone scale column of the Hubbard chart of human behavior is considered the easiest way to identify what level of the chart of human evaluation someone is on. Like, an enthusiastic person looks and behaves a certain way. An angry person looks and behaves a certain way, according to Scientology. And if you can spot that they're angry, you will, according to the Hubbard chart of human evaluation, be able to identify their attitude towards children, their likelihood of survival, how honest or dishonest they are, their endocrine system health level, how much they talk versus how much they listen, the level of how, their various perceptions function, the how well they care for their belongings. And so this Hubbard chart of human evaluation is not scientific or accurate. When my father once was telling me about an auditing session he had, he said, I realized what I needed to do to get through the auditing session and achieve an end result, going over this, memory from my past that, I needed to resolve. All I have to do is go through, each level of the tone scale until the event is released of its emotional charge. And I was like, as a kid, I was like, no, Dad, that doesn't sound right, because then you're adjusting your behavior and your mentality to imitate what's written in the Hubbard chart of human evaluation. And, if that chart was, you're supposed to organically experience this, and you'll naturally, your behaviors will be just naturally classifiable by the chart, but you shouldn't be imitating, what you think you're supposed to do from the chart. And so this Hubbard chart of human evaluation without my realizing it, was very, very cognitively dissonant for me, just for many, many years. And I had spent much time sitting in a course room staring at this chart because I was fascinated and I wanted to understand human behavior. But it was just never, I was like, I must be missing something. I must just not be able to spot it. Because when I would go and do the exercises where you had to go talk to people on the street and spot their tone level, it was like, I never really felt that there was a clear classification or understanding. And, you know, studying acting, I never felt the tone scale was at all instrumental in understanding that. And if you're going to portray a character and go, oh, this character is angry, so I know that they're this and this and this, then what you're doing is essentially performing propaganda for the Scientology tone scale. So if you see Giovanni Ribisi in, you know, A Million Little Pieces, and he's playing a character that he says, okay, they're gay, they're 1-1 on the tone scale, and I know that all these other things must be true about them. That's not accurate to every human story. That's him thinking this tone scale is really gonna give him insight into, you know, traits of the character he's playing, and he's limiting himself as an artist. And he may do a really great job of internalizing these traits and portraying a very real character, but this isn't going to give you the full scope of access to your emotional depth and your understanding of each individual human story you want to tell. And while Giovanni Ribisi is, you know, a great, fine professional actor, I noticed that in his performance in the movie adaptation of James Fry's A Million Little Pieces. I was like, oh, he's kind of playing, he's doing a great job, but he is playing the tone scale, and, you know, he's playing the Hubbard chart of human evaluation in that, I noticed. But he's also, you know, assimilating to American mainstream culture. There's a lot of things going on. And the thing, you know, that I'm getting back to is when you are indoctrinated in a high control group, you're never not your personality in addition to that. So it just means that if you have an indoctrination system you've internalized where you're only allowed to use the terminology of the group and think in the paradigms of the group, it doesn't mean those parts outside of the indoctrination model don't exist. It's just you don't have language and concepts and paradigms to identify them yet. So in an absolute sense, there's no such thing as a pre-cult, post-cult personality. This is more a model that's helpful if, say, you know your sister's in a cult, and you know that before she entered the cult, she loved doing stand-up comedy. But when she joined Scientology, she said, comedy's bad. It's a joker and degrader is one of the worst, you know, things for an organization. I can't do comedy. I'm only studying tragedy in acting school. And I actually did that. And actually, I learned a lot by, you know, comedy was kind of my strength, and I learned a lot by cutting myself off from that and going, I'm only going to do crying scenes, you know, because a lot of times people do try to box you into, oh, she can only do comedy, but she's so hard, she's so strong, she's so unvulnerable, and oh, she's like a very like precious flower actor, she like cries on cue, but she can't do comedy. And I really, because I cut myself off from the comedy thing, I really did become someone who can like feel comfortable and able doing both. But that also speaks to just the American model of the entertainment industry that tries to compartmentalize these two things, comedy and tragedy. It's very complex, but, you know, so I mean, that's an instance where I'm like, hey, like the extreme of Scientology helped me by shutting down one part of my personality that came easily to me, forced me to go into one that, you know, other people tried to say I maybe couldn't do, or they didn't want to see me do, or they felt competitive and didn't want me to be able to do comedy and so you know, and of course I'm getting targeted by a multi-interest black ops that's trying to make me look like an incompetent hack and sabotage my career opportunities. So it's not going to sound credible if I try to talk about myself as an actor right now, unfortunately. But just, and also if you're in Scientology, it's very difficult to trust someone who doesn't have like a glowing public celebrity image going on, and it's very, the complexities are very layered. But with these, you know, indoctrination systems, there are many parts of your personality that exist outside of the ideological framework. It's like, you know, it's like an operating system that you've installed in yourself, and that operating system is meant to prioritize and compartmentalize and flow and exchange information as it's translated into a very specific language. And so you're almost, when you do Scientology, it's like, I mean, for me, there was like this sense of I'm consciously brainwashing myself to be more, you know, successful and organized. And like, you know, I constantly, when I was in high school and middle school, I had people like calling it a cult. And in order to kind of assimilate, I was like, yeah, I guess I'm like in a cult. That's cool. You know, I'm in a cult. Like, and I was like, oh, that's kind of, you know, I kind of used it. I turned it around in a kind of punk reversal and was like, yeah, I'm in a cult. Like, my religion is so cool that, you know, people call it a cult. So there's many sociological factors going on. And you also so this idea of a pre-cult, post-cult personality is, you know, so if you're like, oh, you're trying to get your sister out of a cult, and in her pre-cult personality, I know she loved watching South Park, and now that she's joined Scientology, she's sworn off all comedy and South Park, and she literally never laughs anymore. And humor is good for you. It's good for your nervous system. It accomplishes many things. It's a very specific need that I think society, like, it's like innate to the human societal experience, and just the daily experience. You need to laugh once a day, you know, like, at least, you know, it's really, I really think it's an essential human experience, humor. Even if you're like a cave person living alone in the woods, you need laughter and humor. And you would probably pursue that naturally as a human function. But Scientology's idea is Scientology helps you achieve your goals much more, you know, fulfillingly than just leaving yourself to the elements. And this is true to an extent of all structures. You know, there's a reason we as human beings build societies and compartments and structures and hierarchies rather than just leaving ourselves at the mercy of the elements. And this is because nature is more tyrannical than most dictators. So it's really a harsh reality we as human beings are always contending with, and ideologically or immediately, depending on your context. So this concept of the pre and post cult personality should never be used to say, oh, I was born into a cult, so I don't have a personality. This is not true. You always have a personality, whether you were born into a cult or you joined for 1 month. It's just that the cult is a very rigid structure, and your personality, which is always there, is simply existing in a negative space outside of the cultic structure, in terms of if it, any aspect of yourself that is not innate, that is not empowered by this cultic indoctrination. So that is something I just wanted to add to this idea of pre and post cult personality. I'm sure reading, Recovery from Cults, it's very clearly presented as, a model, but, to someone who's very, very, in a state of complete dysregulation as a symptom of, your whole ideology being upturned after years of rigid adherence, you may get the idea that you didn't have a personality before the indoctrination structure, or you have to have you're a blank slate and you have to have a whole new personality now. And that's not necessarily true. And it's also, let's say another aspect of the pre and post cult personality that I think could negatively affect someone who does have a context that they existed in before joining a cult is, just because you're leaving the cult now doesn't mean your family treated you right, doesn't mean society's all good, doesn't mean you have to put up with shit that you put up with before the cult. You can literally say, no, the cult was right about some stuff, that is why I joined, and then some other stuff is not right. But you don't have to say, oh my God, I love my mom and now my family's so perfect, and I just, the only problem is that I joined a cult. You could it's totally okay to be like, my whole family's fucked up, they're pieces of shit, society's fucked up, it's a piece of shit, but also the cult is fucked up, and I basically am gonna have to play these two evil powers against each other for a while to get my needs fulfilled. It's okay to have that. But you also, I wouldn't recommend a spiral into complete negative thinking at all, or rumination like this. I don't think that's going to be particularly helpful, but I know that I definitely, you want the narrative of, oh, it was, the problem was that I was in a cult and I realized my family is so amazing. Like, that does not have to be true. You can be like, my family sucks, they're abusive, they treated me like shit, I don't want to talk to them, and that's okay. You can say, oh, I joined a cult because a lot of my peers just were jealous of me and I needed to pursue people who would actually tell me how to get ahead in life, not like these haters. It could be many things. It could be you had ambitions, but everybody in your school had rich parents who were sending them to these really classified tutors and power brokers to help their career, and you weren't getting shit and nobody was going to tell you shit. So you're like, you know what? This cult seems like it might help me. And that's okay. But at the same time, you don't want to get sucked into a cult to the point where it's not going to benefit you. There is the story that people repeatedly cite. The dude who wrote Fight Club joined there's this cult that he joined for a weekend, and then it catalyzed him writing Fight Club. But those people who were the success story of the cult, they are either pulling some conscious Machiavellian shit, or they have a lot of cultural contextual soft power that allows them to play the diplomacy of using what works for them and then kind of distancing themselves from the other stuff without getting into too much trouble. And if there's like very severe hierarchies in the cult of like who gets better treatment and who gets, you know, more laxity, that's going to be a factor as well. So studying these class and economic and social complexities is very helpful. You know, Scientology definitely promotes an idea of, you know, oh my God, you don't want to become an academic in an ivory tower. You don't want to study just all the millions of books that exist in the world because you're not going to know which are the quality ones to read. You're just putting yourself in the weeds, and becoming an academic, studying anything too in depth is like the equivalent of basically being totally insane. L. Ron Hubbard's already filtered everything for you. Why not just take these highest possible value knowledge structures rather than subject yourself to just, you know, the swamp and morass of the accumulated human knowledge that almost sits like a hulking burden upon the, you know, the disgrace of our society. And to an extent, that's not totally false. Like, we're experiencing that on the internet where there's just so much free writing where you're like, just, it's almost debilitating, the internet, you know, if you don't navigate it with like a very clear, okay, I'm gonna like do this one thing and then get offline. Like, we've all become like internet addicts if we have access to it. Like, it used to be what is now considered normal internet engagement was considered like diagnosable internet addiction when I was in like middle school. And now if we have access to the internet, we exist in like half online, half offline world. And, you know, the experience is by many large corporations that control the internet experience. The experience is designed to be addictive, and it really does hit a lot of the same, like, habit loops and triggers, you know, as an addiction. Fortunately, you know, I do not think it's nearly as bad as like, you know, actual street drugs and what they can do to you, but it can like waste hours of your life every day in a non-dramatic way and like insidiously destroy your life as well. So there's that. But like, you eventually, if you leave a cult that says you shouldn't go learn all that crazy liberal word salad in school, you're gonna, like, you know, if you're scared that reading a book is gonna corrupt your brain function, you know, and turn you into like an ineffective ivory tower academic who sits and like, you know, inhales your own just like blathering endless overgrowth of unnecessary thought, as opposed to being effective in applying Scientology to like hit your goals, you know, you basically have to learn critical thinking and how to be exposed to information without internalizing it and without taking it as your own truth, and still being able to give your focus to it wholly while knowing this information could be completely without value. Like, you need to learn how to sit and read a book and decide, I'm deciding this book has no value, or okay, this book has some value, or I found one valuable thing, or this book is badly written, this book is well written, this book is a story about this, and the context is this, and how do you decide what book to read? There are millions. And again, the question of how do you decide how to learn? Like, study tech can be a helpful aid for certain people who maybe come from a context where they have no guidance for the basics of knowledge pursuit, whereas there are people who come from very sophisticated families. Even if the families don't have a lot of money, they may have a very high, functioning intellectual and scholarly tradition culturally in their family, where they at home teach critical thinking and how to prioritize information and how to value information and how to navigate social structures and knowledge structures so that you're benefiting yourself and you're achieving your goals. So, if you don't come from a family context that instills those things, study tech can be helpful. It basically, it says you can learn everything. All you have to do is learn all of the terminologies, definitions, give yourself sufficient physical examples with which to interact with the knowledge so that you have a working understanding of whatever it is you're trying to learn, and then make sure you learn that trade or that skill or that thing at proper increments and never at too steep a gradient where you're trying to run before you can walk. And those are pretty much the three most basic principles of study tech that I do feel empowers young children to feel a total agency over their ability to learn things. And there are people who can argue, oh, well, that's completely disregarding, individualized learning and learning disorders. But, you can't also subject children to a system where you are totally disregarding their individual agency and what it takes to motivate a kid to reach goals past what they think they can do. You can't just say to kids, or anyone, you can't just say, oh, this is your profile, your psychological profile, like, this is what you can do. Like, that isn't really, like, if you look at education systems around the world, that's not, how it works, motivating people to learn. You do need to motivate people. People absolutely have individual agency in their performance, and if you try to teach them they don't have free will, you're going to instill a sense of learned helplessness as much as a cult is going to do so. So that's why individual people must educate themselves in order to survive, because you're always at the mercy of multiple interests and industries whose allegiances always are forced to shift in order for them to survive over the course of history. None of this is necessarily good or evil. It's more just human nature. And just acknowledging you as a human being have multiple systems and structures laid over you, and understanding how that impacts your life and how you can navigate and leverage these circumstances, whether fortunate or unfortunate, to your benefit, is more going to help you than not. And that, I think, is why we unfortunately are in the position of having to go through education to exist in society. Like, we just have accumulated knowledge, and you need to basically study what humans have accumulated in school. You do learn math and science and, you know, critical thinking and the beginnings of logic and philosophy. And the more you can like take control of your education and, you know, learn to understand that knowledge is very valuable, and people all over the world who are in positions of power fight and spend a great deal of money to control what knowledge people have access to and what they don't have access to. And if you understand that knowledge is not just this thing that's just sitting around that's like boring and stupid, it's actually very valuable. And if you can figure out how to prioritize knowledge information and how to determine what knowledge and information is very, very valuable and going to help you, you're going to hopefully not use this for evil, and you're going to really open up your access and your opportunities and your ability to like achieve your goals. But, you know, there's something to be said for these high control systems of goal achievement and motivation that, you know, some people associate with cults or gym teachers. But it shouldn't be that like you have to either pay 6 figures to a life coach to achieve your goals, or, you know, just be called a weirdo, you know, psychopath for, you know, wanting to have like a really clear system of organization and achievement for yourself. Like, so yeah, I mean, context and culture and sociology play a huge role in any situation. But when you're in a high control group, you know, like Scientology, if you've internalized that indoctrination system, you're going to be contending with what the group allows you to really acknowledge as valid information regarding like your personality. And then, you know, you're also going to be contending with the outside world, probably teasing and shunning you for being in the cult, and you will eventually either withdraw completely into the cult as a defense mechanism, or you'll become like a super hard, you know, proponent of the cult where you're like, no, I'm all Scientology all the time, and people outside the cult will find you completely unrelatable, and they'll probably like not hire you and not include you in a lot of stuff, which will drive you further into the cult and make you more dependent on them. Or you'll assimilate. The word assimilation is not unfamiliar to many religions that have had to acknowledge their survival circumstances changing throughout history. Assimilation is where, like, yes, this is your religion, but you're going to be able to culturally relate to anyone else, whether that person is like a murderer or like just a super progressive it girl who likes hanging out with you but would totally be humiliated to ever hear you mention Scientology. So it's just, you know, it's really complex. And if you're indoctrinated in Scientology and you're just instinctually assimilating, you're just doing that on instinct. Like, there really isn't a concept of, I mean, there are concepts of assimilation in Scientology, but they use completely different terminology. But, you know, a lot of what you do behaviorally isn't going to be categorized using language that's not Scientology language. So it's going to be basically your behavior and your experience is only allowed to be categorized in Scientology terms, in Scientology and the regions of you that are not are considered like not really relevant or not productive or potentially harmful or misinformation. But this has all just come up in my discussing the basic concept of the pre and post cult personality. I would say a more accurate term would be like pre and post cult context. But even that implies that all of your experience inside and outside the cult has a timeline, and it doesn't completely, because let's say you're born into the cult and you join the Sea Org and your days consist of like working 12 hours a day for the Sea Org. You're still going to be exposed to things that are not in the cult. You might not know it, you might not acknowledge it, you might not be conscious of it, but you are going to be exposed to those things. And so you're going to have a reaction to that. And then you as an individual are still going to have, even though like Scientology doesn't acknowledge that people function differently even in their most ideal state, you're going to have your experience of the cult that is going to be your own versus someone else's, and you just don't have the language to recognize and categorize that experience. That is called, what I believe is a really, really useful term for anybody dealing with cult indoctrination. That word is hypocognition. And so hypocognition means you lack the language for something. And I would go as far to say this also means, because language is also concept. A word is not just a word, it has a concept attached to it. So hypocognition just means you lack words and their, and their corresponding concepts for your vast experience that exists outside of the very rigid indoctrination of the cult or the group. So I think more broadly applicable than the concept of pre-cult and post-cult personality is the idea of your personality as it functions in the context of the cultic indoctrination system. And that includes components of you that the cult considers problematic and components of you that the cult categorizes as, positive. So you've got your in cult existence, and then you have your hypocognitive existence, which is all the aspects of your existence for which you do not have words and conceptual models, and that is always existing. And this is even always existing if you're not in a cult. In society, every day, many people, especially artistic and contemplative intellectual types, but everybody, everybody has parts of their existence that they don't have language for, that they don't have consciousness of. That's why I guess people have always grappled with this idea of the subconscious and the conscious. And the subconscious and the conscious extends beyond simply, trauma storing certain unconscious behaviors and then releasing that trauma. Like, the subconscious doesn't have to purely be something that, crystallizes because of trauma. It's not that. I don't think, I haven't really studied, I've not read, any Jung or Freud or anything like that, but nothing runs purely, like, your brain isn't only gonna, your brain needs subconscious functions, and there are like other self-help books that address the idea of intentionally programming your automatic brain responses and like almost rewiring like your habit loops for your benefit. But like, it's not just that, like the subconscious is not just what can help you be productive. It's like a whole vast terrain and frontier that I really don't know that much about as a concept. But so with the cultic indoctrination system, I don't think you should ever think of yourself as just my pre-cult and my post-cult personality, and I was born into the cult, so I don't have a pre-cult personality. It's just, you have your cultic experience, and then you have your hypocognitive experience. But you're also going to have your experience in the context of like your society and the world. So it is complicated. And, it doesn't mean that the idea of the pre-cult and post-cult personality isn't useful, because it can be very useful to say, oh my God, I remember before I joined the cult, I used to think it was fun to just go sit with my friends for 5 hours on a park bench and like, listen to music. And now that's, I've joined the cult, that's really unproductive. That's really, just a waste of time and like detrimental, and it exposed me to all kinds of bad influences that made my life go downhill. And so, and it's like, maybe that's partially true. Maybe you sat on a park bench with your friends listening to music, and then you met a drug dealer who sold you fentanyl or something. Like, you have to be able to sift through the information and choose what parts were good, what parts were bad, what parts were neutral, and like not throw the whole thing out. Just like you don't want to take your experience in the cult and throw the whole thing out. You want to use your personal critical thinking to process and prioritize information. And it's going to take a lot of work and be very crazy making to resort all of that information when you believed for a very long time that the whole cultic system of indoctrination would do that for you. Because that is it really would be great to have a system that can totally sort and prioritize information for you, and you don't have to think about it. And that, it's like a computer operating system, not having any bugs, not having to do updates. But it seems like with Scientology, if you think about it as an operating system, it doesn't fully do that for you. You're going to have bugs, you're going to have crashes, and you're going to find like, oh my God, the whole Hubbard chart of human evaluation is absolutely not, it's just not real. It's fake. Like, L. Ron Hubbard may have intended to come up with something that helped people, but I don't really know what he intended. He's a very complex, mysterious figure. I'm sure he had some desire to see people thrive. It's not like he, put everyone on a plane and tried to get them to drink Kool-Aid to kill themselves. Like, it seemed like he liked, seeing people improve sometimes, maybe, but it doesn't seem like he's a pure figure, creepy stuff, young girls wearing weird uniforms, being his little messengers, we don't know, stuff. lots of stuff, human trafficking. We don't know, but I don't really know how the whole power changeover from L. Ron Hubbard to Davis Miscavige, there's complex things that it's a real, we hate this chore of having to actually like learn all this stuff and deal with all the stuff that you didn't think you would have to trouble with, because it's like, oh, Scientology gives you like a system of knowledge that works. But unfortunately, you're going to come up with it not working, and you're going to either become cognitively dissonant and not acknowledge that it's not working for you, or you're going to be, oh, God damn it, this doesn't work. And it's really unfortunate, because it would be cool if there was like a perfect system of ideology that solved all of humankind's problems. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the time I'm like, you know what? Maybe there's like just propaganda about the church, and like, maybe it's like actually something that like certain people really don't want me to have access to, because it's a really powerful, useful thing, and they're just like greedy. And like, maybe if I really like, went up the bridge and did the OT levels, like I would actually really be benefiting. Like I'm like, oh, society is like, a lot of society is very crappy in some ways, like, well, maybe I should just like go join the cult and see like maybe there's some useful stuff, and I just won't let them scam me out of like all of the money, that they want. Like, maybe if I just go back and explain to them like, oh, if you really want all of your cult members to be successful, you should encourage them to start putting money in a 401k really early, no matter what job they're at, and then the compound interest will like make it so that they'll be good by retirement age. Like, if you really do want to be a cult of greed and power, you should have all your members like start a 401k and learn about money. So it's just, it's tricky. Like, it's totally valid to be like, oh, maybe like Scientology is way better than most of the alternatives, and like there are just like some weird like regions of the CIA that only want certain people allowed in it. You never know. But the point is like, you want to keep yourself moment to moment out of bad situations. Like, I remember I did have this instance where I was in like the 42nd Street org, and there was like some drill they wanted to show me, and they're like, okay, this is how you like physically stop someone from leaving. You would like hold them down into the chair. And I was like, I am never doing that. I was like, I will never do that. I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to hold someone in a chair and stop them from leaving. I was like, how would that ever be able to fly? Like, you can't do that. Like, that's not going to fly. Like, how can you do that? In that moment, they may have been like, they may have put me on some sort of list of like, okay, this person's doesn't get it, like that surely went into some sort of knowledge report about me, I would guess. But it's like, you could be indoctrinated into a great deal of things. But if you physically come up with, oh, we want you to commit this crime, you have to be like, I can't do that, even though I know that according to my religion or indoctrination system, I should commit this crime. I will not do that. Like, you basically have to not let anyone use your belief system to manipulate you into physical acts past certain lines that you just draw for yourself. You need to say like, oh, I'm indoctrinated to believe that I should do this, but I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to touch someone. I'm not going to, you know, do anything extreme. Like, you need to be basically, like, there's lots of context in society, not just Scientology, many different small towns, many different activist groups, many different occupational situations where you'll be ostracized to some degree if you don't act like everyone else. If you don't participate in committing certain abuses, or if you simply don't participate in saying, oh, I'm gonna, you know, hold the flag, or I'm gonna say the slogan. Like, you could just be a person who doesn't like slogans. You don't like doing, you know, these group heavy behaviors. That doesn't mean you're bad or good person. It's just maybe more a trait that you have, you know. And if you are a person who likes slogans and group organization and conforming for the purpose of achieving a goal, that can be a positive trait. Like, you know, not all conformity, not all group behaviors, not all slogans, not all, you know, sign holding and rallying is bad. It can be very, very important. But I'm someone who, I don't really gravitate towards slogans and signs and conforming group behaviors. When I was in Scientology, I did not gravitate towards that. And in other situations, I have not gravitated towards that. So the Scientology, along with like completely ideologically opposite activist groups, would both criticize me for being too bland, too diplomatic. And, you know, that could be determined by many things. So, you know, it takes all kinds. But I definitely do think that the word hypocognition is a really good way to add a dimension to the concept of the pre-cult, post-cult personality. Because if you didn't have a life context that existed prior to your immersion in a cult or religious group, that, you know, you were born into this context, you still have moment to moment hypocognitive experiences that are outside of the framework of the cult, that you might just not have language for, or you may have been encouraged by your indoctrination system to repress. It could be an emotional reaction you had that didn't make sense with your understanding on an intellectual level of the Scientology tone scale. It could be something you observed in a person that wasn't consistent with what you learned on an intellectual level from the Hubbard chart of human evaluation. It could be an inconsistency that you spotted, you know, in a person that you just accept, even though it contradicts what you've learned in Scientology, and you just know not to talk about, or you'll get written up for verbal tech. Or maybe you did do a knowledge report on some person, you know, and that person corrected their behavior so that now they're conforming to like what is considered correct behavior as per like Scientology and Dianetics, but maybe there's another alternative reality in which you you're missing out on behaviors and experiences and human functions that aren't enforced by Scientology's Hubbard chart of human evaluation and technology. The interesting thing about following one very rigid indoctrination system and internalizing it is, allegedly when you repeat any activity or task, it creates patterns in your brain, and the more you repeat it, the more those grooves and patterns and synaptic interactions solidify and grow. There's a part of the brain called the violinist's arm that develops in violinists, and it gets bigger and grows the more you practice violin. Albert Einstein had it when they dissected his brain. He actually studied, I think he did violin at the Settlement Music School in Philadelphia, where I studied piano growing up. It was a really great school. And so I do think about when you have a very rigid indoctrination system that forces you to focus on one really strict set of principles, but also allows you to relieve yourself of any contradicting philosophy or noise, you're probably setting some very deep patterns and repetitive circuitry in your brain and behavior that is going to take a lot of work to extrapolate, okay, what am I going to keep that benefits me? My cult-like work ethic, for example, the ability to work 12 hours and be single-minded and ignore my exhaustion. This can benefit me, but it can also cause serious health problems and, a lack of emotional regulation, a lack of reflection, a lack of quality work versus single-minded tunnel vision, brunt work. Constant exhaustion, the ability to pull a crazy all-nighter, that can be helpful, but that can also be detrimental. You need to be able to go, okay, what are some other patterns in my habits and my brain functions that I may need to form as a complete departure from these other things that I learned in the cult, or maybe I just need to change it a little, or maybe I need to just supplement it a little. So it's like, okay, I can pull this all-nighter once a year, but you can't really pull all-nighters like past a certain age without it just really just being a problem. I mean, there's just so many factors, and unfortunately, I don't think Scientology gives you all the knowledge you need. If you are assimilating with different knowledges and cultures, like outside of Scientology, and you're not getting in trouble for it, good for you. But it takes a real conscious decision to basically be a knowing kind of diplomat and go, I'm going to use Scientology, but I am not going to indoctrinate myself. But some people do that consciously, but they're really consciously being a politician, and they're going, okay, I'm gonna do some stuff with Scientology if it'll help me, if it'll help my general community acceptance, or it's just going to help me be diplomatic. Like, but if you're really going in it as a full, like, learning journey, you're gonna either have to openly oppose the church, and then they're gonna get you in trouble for it, or you're gonna become totally indoctrinated, or you're playing like the Machiavellian angle. I think those are the three main options with Scientology: full indoctrination, or you express one thing that you don't accept and you'll never accept, and then you're gonna get fair gamed and subjected to like $1 billion spy operation, or you are gonna consciously be a Machiavellian, and you're gonna go, oh, this important board member at my child's school is a Scientologist and can get my kid into Harvard. Let me take him down for a study tech course, and you give your kid a firm talking to in the car of, don't you dare fucking join this crazy ass cult. We are just doing this so you can get into Harvard pre-college summer, something like that. I think those are the three options: Machiavellian, total like adherence, or enemy. Or you kind of have to feign mediocrity and just go under the radar, so gray rocking. That's just, I think, how the organizational technology is structured to function. And I don't think even anybody individually in the church is more or less bad than anybody individually in any organization. I just think like various traits and factors and context landed them into that position. And then even if you're like becoming a full-on spy for the church, I think it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I think probably the regulation of how like predators are treated when they get into the church. People who are sexually predatory is something interesting to look at, because every religious, government, business organization has people that go in there that are sexual predators, and it's just interesting to see, like, do some religions allow this kind of person to actually thrive and totally hack the system and just exploit people to no end, and what is the occurrence and recurrence of that, and it doesn't seem that many religions have a good system in place to, stop that behavior from harming people. I only know what I've read from people who've actually spoken out about instances of that, and I think just purely out of luck, I never met, some predator who cornered me or had power enough over me to like physically violate me in any way. that I know of, at a conscious age, in a conscious state. But the language in Scientology doesn't seem to offer a identification and discipline towards sexually exploitative behaviors. What it or really a behavior and discipline of somebody committing wrongs against you individually. It has a very rigid behavior and discipline towards anyone breaking Scientology policy, which I'm sure the right person could use as a way to identify and discipline sexually exploitative behaviors in the same way that somebody exploitative could hack that system for their benefit. But paradoxically, the concept of child Dianetics enforces this idea that children are like fully self-determined, like in many ways superior to adults. And so that can be used to exploit children because it says, oh, you're fully self-determined, you make your own choices, anything that happens to you, you pulled in. But it can also empower a child to be like, oh, fuck you, that's a child molester. So it's a double-edged sword, because it can make a child go, I am an adult, you do not get to do this and that, and I have agency, I do not have to hide anybody else's bad deeds. But it can also be twisted around to take a child without acknowledging their real psychological and intellectual vulnerabilities and make them feel totally responsible for concealing the predatory acts of a perceived high-ranking member of the church. So it's really, it's case-by-case basis. You could have a child study child Dianetics and be like, oh, fuck you, no adult gets to touch me. I am a complete, individual being with my own self-determinism. Don't fucking touch me. All predators stay away. But you could also have somebody learn child Dianetics and have it turned against them to exploit and control them. It really has to do with a lot of different factors and contextual elements and individual traits and individual circumstances and just the shit show of luck of the draw. What happens to people. And the study of that complexity is not within the scope of Scientology teachings. It's in the scope of sociology and psychology. And unfortunately, when you extrapolate yourself from a pure Scientology indoctrination system, you really want there's a craving to just fully believe any new thing that you read and go, oh, this is the system that works. You're always going to have to do the work of thinking critically, and you're always going to have to do the work of thinking in terms of context and individual traits and case by case and character and conflicts of interest and historical context and using what works for you. And actually, that's really exhausting. It's a level of decision fatigue that is really troublesome. Because having a rigid system of indoctrination eliminates a great deal of decision fatigue and does allow you to think clearly along certain channels. Even if your indoctrination system is like completely faulty and cognitively dissonant, it can be very, in some activities, not the worst thing to have a complete removal of the decision fatigue that I think defines the modern day liberal arts education citizen. But ultimately, those modern day liberal arts educated citizens are the ones who are stopping to look at stuff that is really important, that, you know, looks like this superfluous academic, you know, half existence of, you know, the like silly liberal, but actually this is the real like nuts and bolts of like being a citizen and existing in society. And unfortunately, it's just way more complex than it was when people were like drawing, you know, Pythagoras' theorem in the sand and like wearing togas. But also we have stuff like vaccines and like clean drinking water that allow us to have a longer lifespan, and spend time on these tedious yet necessary information evaluation tasks that we as citizens are left to do when we look at, you know, the political climate and what a local election decision is going to do to impact our daily lives and that political climate. So it's better than having to live alone as a cave person in nature. And that's ultimately, like, I guess, the point of society. But being in the weeds of all of this unsorted information is, for people who didn't ever go into a cult and maybe grew up in a fairly economically and educationally affluent context, I think they go through this like in 7th or 8th grade. It's like a intellectual adolescence of sorts. It doesn't mean your brain is not, you know, a genius computer. It doesn't mean your brain is not an adult brain, but it's going through something that other people with more educational access earlier in life, I think, go through in, you know, 6th or 7th grade, 8th grade, you know, where they're watching the news and they can't prioritize and they're going to school and going, but how can we go to school when everyone is dying in this part of the world? I'm going to leave school and I'm just going to become like, you know, a full-time like nun or something. Like, people go through, I think, what people experience when they leave a cult. You know, that's like maybe something if you had better educational access, because a lot of times I think entry into a cult is going to be because of lack of educational access, lack of economic access, lack of opportunity access. Those three things are huge. Because educational access is being about, is like about, you know, learning how to identify and achieve your goals as much as it is, you know, learning valuable knowledge. But that's also opportunity access. Just, you know, the experience of being overwhelmed by the knowledge of the world, and that's like a academic experience, you know, private school kids who have more economic opportunity and educational access kind of go through in high school. But with cult, it's a whole other level, because your indoctrination system, it's like getting ripped out of you, you know, almost like a shrimp being deveined, and suddenly you have no regulatory like knowledge, nothing you can cling on to, like not the stable data principle that L. Ron Hubbard talks about, which I think is valid. This idea of if there's chaos all around you and there's one stable data that you can cling to that can basically calm and regulate your nervous system and allow you to put other things into place. But ideally, you want to be in a place where you're not always just in a storm having to pick one piece of stable data. You want to be able to function on a high level and like regain control of like your executive functioning. So just with Scientology and with exiting a high control indoctrination system that you've internalized, in addition to the term hypocognition, another very valuable piece of terminology is the reticular activation system, which is really just something I've not even read a book about it. I've watched YouTube videos about it, but it really was quite useful and turned on a number of light bulbs for me once I learned about the reticular activation system. It's a system in your brain that is able to sort information and identify related information, basically identify patterns. And so an example, I mean, look up a 5-minute YouTube video about it and you'll understand why it's so relevant to someone who's suddenly faced with their existing ideology being invalidated and having to figure out the world without any reference point, or with very little reference point. So if, a basic example of reticular activation system would be, you had no idea that there is such a thing as like I want to think of an example that's not going to be polarizing politically or something. Let me think. Hold on. I want to think of a good example too that really illustrates this idea. Okay. Reticular activation system. Okay. Think about the Public Theater. There is a theater in downtown New York called the Public Theater that is a famous, legendary theater. Hamilton, I think, was first produced there. A Chorus Line was first produced there. It's just a legendary institution in New York, right? So let's say you never heard about the Public Theater. You never knew it existed. You have no idea there's a theater called the Public Theater. And your friend says, I'm going to the Public. And all you understand that to mean is that they're going to the public, the general population. And you're like, what do you mean you're going to the public? And they're like, I'm going to the public, see you later. And they walk out the door. And in your mind, you just think that they're going to the public with some information and they didn't specify with, and then they just left, and they didn't specify what they're going to the public with. Are they going to the public with some scandal? And you don't understand what they're talking about. And then suddenly you learn that there is a theater called the Public Theater, and that people often will just call it the Public. So now, like, every time you hear, so that's one, that's a good example of a misunderstood word. But also, it's an example of a really good name for a theater. And, but also now that you understand, oh my God, the public theater is the name of a theater, and all my life people have been saying the public, and they could have been talking about the theater. So now every time somebody says the public, the public, the public, the public, you notice it. And you pull it together in your mind. Your reticular activation system filters it out from all the general white noise. And the reticular activation system's job is really just to filter that out. But generally, we tend to take those unrelated pieces of information that the reticular activation system has filtered out and then placed together. And if we're not careful with our critical thinking, we can try to put those pieces of information together in ways that are not accurate and form false things and false ideas, and often conspiracy theories. So the reticular activation system kind of goes haywire when an indoctrination system is removed, and it starts to try to resort all the information that it once did not have to work to sort, because the indoctrination system sorted information for you. And so it goes haywire, and it tries to connect all these dots, and you can easily just go into overdrive and just form all of these completely inaccurate conclusions, and just instead of simply taking the information and allowing it to be sorted together for now for further evaluation, you have this obsessive need to have it be significant, because you're in search of and craving applied knowledge. You want something that makes sense. You want something that you can apply. It's very difficult to sort and prioritize information without, jumping to conclusions. You want to really try to remember or learn, if you haven't, the basic scientific method that, a lot of people learn in, middle school science class, where, it's only a few steps, but you need to look at information, and you're allowed to form a hypothesis. But in order to prove the hypothesis, you have to test it, and you have to write the proof. So you're allowed to let your reticular activation system pull out information, put it in a pile, and say, oh, here's one hypothesis, oh, here's another hypothesis. But I'm only going to present these as hypotheses. I have to actually test and prove them first. I'm not going to present these hypotheses as, oh, this is what happened, this is real. Because then you're just being a conspiracy theorist. You're skipping a few steps in the scientific method. Scientology's fallacy is they present their indoctrination system as a scientific technology that works every time. And in order to accept that, you have to become cognitively dissonant. Certain basic common sense principles that have been, ordered and branded as Scientology, like, study technology and certain organizational ideas work to an extent. But like the whole Hubbard chart of human evaluation, you're going to find that you either have to admit this is cognitive, that it's not true, and you'll become, an enemy of the church. Or you will have to become cognitively dissonant. And this has, a lot of my way of recognizing this was specifically through their classification of sexual behavior on the Hubbard chart of human evaluation, because all homosexual traits are automatically classified as like an aberration, right? But even if you're totally heterosexual and you're like, okay, well, no, this you will still find the chart is cognitively dissonant in many areas, not just sexual behavior. Even if I were to say, okay, yes, I'm gay, but I'm gonna use all that there is to offer in Scientology, I would still be forced to admit that many things on the chart of Hubbard, the Hubbard chart of human evaluation, are simply not accurate. They are not accurate, and unfortunately, the entire system of evaluating somebody's progress in Scientology for auditors is based on the Hubbard chart of human evaluation in terms of evaluating behavior. But in order to function, there's a lot of unspoken fudging that has to be going on. All rigid systems of indoctrination, humanity finds a way to shine through, whether for the better or for the worse. So you're going to have a lot of people who are going to instinctively intuit, without consciously acknowledging it, that they're functioning in a cognitively dissonant system, and they're going to do things that, let people advance or give them the benefit. Just as you're going to have that small, I think hopefully smaller percentage of predatorial people that are going to fudge the system to be predatorial. But, just as you have these fascist ideologies throughout history where people were obeying things overtly, but, helping people on the sly, it's kind of like that. Like, if you're functioning in a rigid indoctrination system and you've internalized it, and your humanity is going to come through in certain ways where if it's cognitively dissonant, you're going to fudge it to the benefit maybe of other people, but it's going to ultimately be just very harmful to be trying to function in this cognitive dissonance for too long. Cognitive dissonance is always worse than conscious conflict of the intellect or conscious paradox. But you can get by with it for a long time. The one thing about the lack of decision fatigue with a rigid indoctrination system, despite it being cognitively dissonant, is the factor of like PTSD and CPTSD. So there's that. Like if you're in a high functioning state of indoctrination and you get the benefit of eliminating decision fatigue, the trade-off can be that you're going to be dealing with like post-traumatic stress disorder or like stress disorder. So there's always trade-offs, like the state of, but that's I think a bigger trade-off. Would the government care as much about getting, addressing the problematic components of Scientology. If, if this was a different context and it could be leveraged to benefit the government more, that's a controversial debate I'm sure that many people have on their minds. Would they care if it was just, something that big corporations used to make their labor force more compliant? I don't want to think about that. The fact that it's an independent religious organization that can be alternately vilified and praised is, I guess, better than, this is just, Amazon's labor practices. So who knows? But that's also why we have higher education institutions, because these things unfortunately have to be studied in depth and it takes a lot of work. But you don't want to go out into the world with less of an education than you can access. Even if you can't pay for school without going into debt, you should be reading and learning independently, because you'll get screwed if you don't. Ultimately, you will get screwed. If you don't get sucked into a cult for lack of education, you'll get screwed over by wealthy, powerful people. It's really always better to learn and understand how to truly apply logic and the scientific method and self-education practices, because human attention and human intellect is at a higher than ever real estate value than it has been before. So you want it to work to your benefit as much as possible and be charging other people rent for that. But yeah, the term hypocognition and reticular activation system and the book Recovery from Cults, very, very useful. I think reading Recovery from Cults, one of the things the book surely wants to accomplish is, after you've read it a few times or even once, you have the ability to debate debate in a meaningful, quality way with the book itself. That would, I imagine, only please the people who've written that book. That you're able to exist in an environment where it's safe and encouraged to learn and agree or disagree or put in the maybe pile your process of learning new ideas, and also contributing your own insights and opinions, and not have it feel like you're committing a crime by adding something new to the conversation, without having to, indenture yourself to, something you may say out loud one day and then decide you don't hold as an opinion anymore the next day. You are allowed to have opinions and say words that you can later not agree with. It's not a life sentence, and it shouldn't be treated as such. But that is a measure of, if an environment is intellectually healthy, the ability to function intellectually and creatively in a way that's spontaneous, that's not going to condemn you to your own opinion or someone else's, but also respectful and quality and, exerting community concern onto yourself and understanding, yes, you're free to explore all of your ideas. Sometimes there's a time and a place, your private journal, you know, you reading at home. You can't say everything in front of everyone, you know, without some filtering or drafting or outlining or structuring. I mean, you probably don't want to, but with somebody who's coming out of the Scientology indoctrination system, it's like a vast process, because you have to rework your understanding of, you know, what constitutes a valid reason to even feel guilty in the first place, because you get punished for the high crime of verbal tech, and you're, you know, firmly rooted in the overt withhold right up model. So, you know, these things cause you to completely turn in on yourself and spiral into just a loop of complete self-flagellation. And that is just a thing where you have to kind of step back and stop, drop, and roll and say, okay, I don't currently have another system of thought and belief to cope with this, but I know that this is not the only option, so I can step back. I'm not obligated to feel this. I'm not obligated to spiral into this. I can pause on where my thoughts are going, because there are many systems of indoctrination and thought and philosophy, and the thoughts I'm having and the way they're being shaped is not all purely necessarily my doing. So it's not necessarily the natural order of things for you to follow your internalized indoctrination system as it exists, nor for you to follow the power vacuum that happens when that indoctrination system is invalidated and you find yourself dismissing everything. So yeah, I guess that's a third term that's really good to learn. Power vacuum. Because basically that's what's happening when you are experiencing like the extraction of a rigid system of indoctrination from your way of functioning. Like, it's a power vacuum. So just because you had this indoctrination system like removed and now you don't know what to think, it doesn't mean your random impulses are necessarily right, because they might not even be yours. They could be influences of other subconscious stuff. You do not have to like go run and jump off a bridge or like, you know, do something crazy to prove that you're, you know, a spontaneous human being again. Like, you should protect yourself from things. It can help to read, it can help to write in a journal. But in Recovery from Cults, it definitely says many cult defectors are diagnosed, they're misdiagnosed as like just organically psychotic, because there's a lot of symptoms that imitate psychosis that happen when a person is experiencing this power vacuum or this ideological vacuum that takes place when they're forced to dismiss their rigid indoctrination system as being faulty. Hypocognition, reticular activation system, power vacuum, recovery from cults. Another really good book is called The Power of Habit. It's very good. It's not vague. It's very precise. It like basically teaches you like a simple, workable model of like a habit loop. It's like basic habit formation. That it's not rooted in any like philosophy or political tradition to the point of being like restrictive or exclusive. And I think it maybe falls under the category of like operant conditioning. I'm not sure, but it's in that area of like self-improvement that basically has to do with like micro habits, and it is very useful. I've used it to like reprogram like habits that I had before Scientology that Scientology didn't fix, that came from like certain dysfunctional components of my upbringing. Nothing too crazy, just like the unfortunate like psychological drama of struggling with being on time, stuff like that. But those you know, 5 little tidbits of knowledge: recovery from cults, the power of habit, and then the terms hypocognition, reticular activation system, and power vacuum have opened up huge windows of learning growth for me personally that are both valuable in an applied knowledge sense and a nervous system regulation sense and an educational sense. And I highly recommend that anybody who's dealing with transitioning out of a rigid indoctrination system pursues learning about those things.